cannot be reduced to its ultimate physical constituents for the simple reason that you can change those constituents within certain limits and not change what the table is. You don't need to know about the exact status of every electron on the table for it to be treated as the same table. So there's a kind of emergence there. The emergence does not have to be unexplainable. Sometimes emergence is treated as something that could not have been predicted. The fact that it cannot be predicted, I think, is accidental. You can predict a lot of the properties of chemicals using quantum theory, but it doesn't mean they don't emerge just because you can predict them. And so I call that undermining. When someone tries to explain away a thing by breaking it down to its ultimate tiny constituent pieces, you're undermining it. It's mine in French. You're trying to find the lowest level of reality that explains everything else. And then I coined the opposite term, which doesn't exist in English, overmining, to refer to the opposite level, the opposite maneuver, which is when you go upward. And you don't, instead of saying that the table is too shallow to be true because it's really made of all these tiny things, you say the idea of a table deeper than any experience of it, or deeper than any event involving the table, or deeper than any relation to it, is simply a naively posited fiction that naive realists believe in, when actually we know that the table is simply a set of appearances, or a trajectory across time, or an event, or any of these other things, which are supposed to be more directly accessible to us than the table. But I think the real table is the third one, the one in between those two. It's the table that is neither reducible downward to its pieces, because that cannot explain emergence, nor is it reducible upward to its effects, because if you do that, you cannot explain the new effects, the future effects that it has. If the table is nothing more than all the effects it has on you and me and all the other objects right now, how can you ever explain the table having new effects in the future? You'd have to end up with some theory where it only resembles, the table 5 minutes from now is only a close family relative of this table, but they're actually not the same, and someone has to link them. You find theories like this in Latour, maybe in Whitehead, and I think they're wrong. I think you have to take seriously the idea that a table is a unit, different from both its constituent components and from its effects. So, object-oriented philosophy, in addition to being realist, also talks about tensions in things. I'll reverse my usual order and talk about the way that phenomenology was critiqued by Heidegger from 1919 onwards. Phenomenology, it's safe to say, was partially a reaction against phenomenology began in 1900, 1901 with Edmund Husserl publishing The Logical Investigations. It's safe to say that it was a reaction to the ongoing triumph of the natural sciences and the idea that philosophy was getting boxed into a smaller and smaller corner. And the way phenomenology responded to this, at least in Husserl, was to say we should suspend any theories we have about the outside world and how the outside world is generating the appearances of my consciousness. That when you hear a door slam, you should simply describe all the subtleties of that experience of hearing the door slam. Don't immediately move on to some chemical theory of the nervous system and sound waves going through the air. We don't have direct access to that, Husserl says. What we have direct access to is only my experience of the door slamming and all the various subtleties of that experience in my mind. And so philosophy becomes a very patient technical description of experience, bracketing any specific theories. And of course, that's under fire today from people who want to recover the truths of scientific naturalism, and I understand that. There's more to phenomenology than that, though, as I'll explain in a second. But first, Heidegger's critique of this is very simple and very powerful. I think the most powerful moment of 20th century philosophy. Heidegger points out that consciousness is actually a fairly rare type of access to the things. It's quite rare that you or I are conscious of things and experiencing them directly. More often what you are doing is relying on things unconsciously. You're relying on the floor, for example, not to collapse. If the floor were to collapse, you would notice because you would start toppling into the foundations of the building. If your bodily organs began to fail, you would notice it. You would have to be rushed to the hospital. But until I mentioned it, you probably weren't thinking of them if you're reasonably healthy. If you're reasonably comfortable with English, you're probably not thinking of my grammar too much. Nor am I thinking of my grammar too much, since it's my native language. But if you're learning a foreign language, you have to sometimes consciously think of what's the right declension for this verb and worrying about whether you're messing it up. So you see, for Heidegger, the primary mode of access to things is relying on them, taking them for granted, silently and invisibly. And for Heidegger, of course, in the famous tool analysis, things generally emerge only in their malfunction, only when they fail us in some way. Not only, but that's the primary way. The hammer breaks, the bus does not come on time, there's an earthquake and the ground is no longer stable, and so forth. This is Heidegger. So, in his question of being, comes directly out of this. Being is that which resists all presence for Heidegger. It's that which never can become present. It can send various incarnations of itself into various times in history, but it never becomes present directly. Being is that which is not present. So the question of being is actually answered in Heidegger. It's not as mysterious as people think. So you might think now Husserl is just this poor retrograde idealist who doesn't understand that there's things hiding behind the appearances. Actually, first let me say something else about Heidegger before I move on to Husserl. Heidegger is often interpreted, I think, in a shallow manner. It's often interpreted, this tool analysis, to mean that praxis comes before theory. So that before we can make a theory about anything, before we can perceive anything, there's this practical use of things. You're practically using your bodily organs or practically sitting on the chair, and then the theory comes after the praxis. The problem with that, as I've argued in print many times, is that praxis distorts the things and oversimplifies them as much as the theory does. So when you're sitting in the chair, you are oversimplifying that chair, you are turning it into a caricature just as much as when you look at it. So you cannot say that Heidegger's distinction is one between unconscious and conscious, between praxis and theory. You have to say that when you're sitting in the chair, you're not noticing the things in the chair that dogs and mosquitoes and raindrops encounter when they encounter the chair, because you're limited by your own capacities for perception. And then finally, you have to push that one step further, and this is the part of object-oriented philosophy that people really rebel against. Which is that objects do this to each other as well. This is not some privileged, tragic human capacity that we caricature things and oversimplify them. That was the limit of Kant. Oh, no. Kant's notion that we have no direct access to the things themselves is, in my opinion, right, but he's wrong in limiting it to a special human problem, where it's humans who are, or maybe all rational creatures, who are unfortunately unable to grasp the things of themselves. I say the same thing happens in causal interaction between mindless chunks of matter. They too are also not going to unlock all of each other's features because they're not going to be equipped to do that. And so you have a universal system of relations in which nothing exhausts anything else, nothing fully grasps anything else. Things deal with caricatures of each other only, not with their full reality. And this leads to charges of panpsychism, and this debate is ongoing. No, because it's something much more primitive than psyche. It's a kind of very primitive sort of relation of which the human psychology would be one very special case. Anyway, okay, so much for Heidegger. Now back to Husserl. The last time we saw Husserl 5 minutes ago, he looked like a poor traditionalistic dupe who thought that everything was phenomenal, that there was nothing hiding underneath perception. Nonetheless, Husserl does something I think that is unprecedented in the history of philosophy, which is that he creates, I said object-oriented philosophy is about tensions. We've already talked about a tension between the real things that are hidden for Heidegger and the phenomenal surface of the world, which becomes accessible to us. There's a second and separate tension in Husserl, which makes things complicated and interesting. And that is the idea that even within the realm of experience, even within human experience, there is a tension between an object and its qualities. And Gabriel's paper touched on this to some extent. David Hume and his empiricist friends thought, for example, there's no such thing as an apple. When you think you are holding an apple in your hand, what you're actually holding is red, shiny, hard, juicy, 79 cents, whatever all the qualities of an apple. You're holding those, and you're the one who's binding them. What's binding them? It's a bundle of qualities for Hume. What is the binding agent? The binding agent is your habit. Through habit, you see these qualities go together so frequently that you start to get in the habit of thinking of all these qualities being attached, when in fact, there's no unit there. There's nothing over and above all the qualities, according to Hume. What is most typical of Husserl and of phenomenology as a whole is the idea that Hume has it backwards. And he does this kind of quietly. I don't think Husserl totally realizes this. He develops this position in conflict with some of his fellow students in Vienna, who I won't go into all that now, but I've written about it elsewhere. Husserl says you encounter the unit first. You encounter the unit apple first, and the qualities are then colored by that unit. It's exactly the reverse. And the proof of this is simply that you can experience an object with different qualities, and yet you never think of it as being a different object. You can turn the apple in your hand and see different qualities. You can look at the apple once a day for 10 days and watch it slowly rot. You can let it warm up after taking it out of the refrigerator. You can view the apple from different angles and distances in different moods, and yet you never stop thinking of it as the same apple. And since we're talking only about experience here, you here are the judge. You're not going to be in error about this, because it's only a question now of whether you recognize it as the same apple. And the question is you do. You look right through all those qualities. The apple as a unit in your experience is able to sustain many different qualities at different times. And what phenomenology is all about for Husserl is analyzing which of these qualities are accidental, which of them are mere adumbrations, Abschattungen, donation par esquisse, I think it is in French, being given by sketches, by profiles. You're supposed to vary the object in perception in your experience, or even only in your mind, and try to figure out which of those features are the really essential ones, or the eidetic ones. Again, a link with Gabriel's paper this morning. Which qualities really need to be there in order for the apple to still be an apple? If it goes far enough, you no longer think of it as an apple, you say, I was deceived, it was something else. But there are a large number of the qualities of the apple that can be stripped away, and it still remains the same thing. Now, in both cases, you have a tension. You have a tension between objects and qualities. And here I am going to draw something on the board, just so you have a diagram.
Sorry?
It wasn't. Oh, there it is. Okay. So you have a fourfold, and I've written a whole book about this that's in both French and English. And these abbreviations will be real object, real qualities. I call this the sensual object and the sensual qualities, because these exist for us. These exist as determinants of our experience. These are the things that hide from experience. And there end up being tensions between every possible pair of object and qualities. And without going into all the details yet, I call them time, space, eidos, and essence. And I do think this is the root of time, space, essence, and eidos. We usually talk about time and space as two privileged continua that explain all of the cosmos. I interpret time and space as emerging from different fractures in the relation between an object and its qualities. And that leaves two other spaces on the grid, which you can explain as essence and eidos. And I may get into some of that here. Here's one of the ways that Levi and I differ, because I think Levi's system is a twofold, really. For Levi, there is the virtual proper being of the apple and local manifestations of the apple. Is that fair?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't want to get into it. Okay. But I mean, when you're looking at the interior of an object and how it encounters another object, you get something very similar to what you're talking about with your sensual objects and units and everything. And so, all right.
Maybe I'll just go on, and if I'm misinterpreting you, we can discuss that in the panel or something. The way I interpret Levi is that you have a virtual proper being of the apple, which cannot be pinned down to specific qualities, because then Levi's worry is that otherwise it could never change. It will be fixed in place, right? The apple will be fixed with certain specific qualities if we did that, and it wouldn't be able to evolve, right? It wouldn't be able to have any genetic component. And then you have the local manifestations. So in my reading, Levi's system is something like this diagonal. One thing I never see in Levi's writings is any attention to this Husserlian breakthrough, as I regard it. It seems to me Levi would have a hard time explaining how the local manifestations, different local manifestations of the same apple can refer to the same object within experience. I know you're using that virtual proper being of the apple as an anchor for different possible local manifestations to different people or different things. But within experience, it seems to me that if I churn the apple in my hand, for you, it becomes a different local manifestation, because it seems to me that your position implies a bundle of qualities theory. That's, I think, our first difference. I'll get to the second one in a little while. In any case, I think Levi has a twofold structure rather than a fourfold structure. Actually, I'm going to get right away into our second difference, because another difference. I should go back to this microphone. Another difference between my position and Levi's. For me, since objects withdraw from any contact, and not just from the human mind, relations become a problem. I mean, obviously relations occur. Relations between things occur, things influence each other. I'm not contesting that. What I am contesting is whether this process is adequately understood. How do things affect each other? It's actually quite a profound and simple philosophical problem. How can things both be autonomous and interlinked? They seem to be both. If